Everyone knows this story. It is November 1875. Word has reached the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, that the ruler of Egypt is about to sell his shares in the Suez Canal Company and that French bankers are circling. Disraeli sends his private secretary, Montague Corey, into the city of London to New Court, the counting house of N.M. Rothschild and Sons. Corey finds Baron Lionel de Rothschild eating grapes. The Prime Minister, he says, needs £4 million by tomorrow. Rothschild eats a muscatel, throws out the skin, and asks, "What is your security?" Corey answers, "The British government." And Rothschild says, "You shall have it." It is a magnificent scene. It is also, as the story has always been told, a story rather than a record. The dialogue comes from Corey's own recollection, long after the fact, and entered the canon through Montepenny and Buckle's official biography. Niall Ferguson, the first historian granted unrestricted access to all the surviving Rothschild archives, calls it partly fantasy. Disraeli had almost certainly discussed the loan with Rothschild beforehand. And the Rothschild Archive itself says, according to legend, this was transacted on a gentleman's agreement, with no documentation, a technically unsecured loan, according to legend. Hold on to that phrase. Everything that follows depends on the difference between a legend and a ledger, because here is what should trouble you far more than the grape. Even if every syllable of it were true, it describes a transaction that did almost nothing you have been told it did. Britain did not buy the Suez Canal. It could not, the canal was never for sale. What was for sale was a block of shares in a private, French-registered company operating a waterway under an Egyptian concession. Britain bought a minority holding. It bought no dividends. They had already been sold to somebody else. It bought 10 votes. It bought no canal at all. And nobody in Parliament was asked, because Parliament was not sitting. The Commons had risen in August and would not reassemble until February. Disraeli committed nearly £4 million of public money, a sum the historian Kathleen Burk puts at more than 8% of the entire United Kingdom budget net, she specifies, of debt charges without a vote of any kind. And the money did not go into the canal, it went to Egypt's creditors. 5 months later, Egypt went bankrupt anyway. So what did £4 million actually buy? Who really paid for it? And why does a transaction its own architect admitted was a financial failure still sit at the heart of the most persistent conspiracy theory in modern history? Here is the full story. The engine of this story is not a canal. The engine is money, sovereign debt, and the private credit that manufactures it. Between 1862 and 1873, European banking houses lent the ruler of Egypt sums he could never repay, secured against his railways, his salt tax, his peasants' harvests. When the interest devoured his revenue, he sold the last unmortgaged asset he had, his shares in the canal his people had dug. Britain bought them. Then Egypt defaulted. The creditors installed themselves inside the Egyptian treasury, and when Egyptians revolted against the receivership, the British army enforced it. That mechanism is printed in Hansard and in statute. It was simply never the chapter you were taught. To understand what Britain bought, you first have to understand what was for sale. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. The Compagnie Universelle du Canal Maritime de Suez was floated in 1858, 400,000 shares at 500 francs. Under the concession, profits were split 3 ways, 75% to the shareholders, 15% to the Egyptian government, 10% to the founders. The country whose people would dig it was entitled to 15%. And they did dig it. Under a decree of Said Pasha, the company was supplied with the corvée, the unpaid compulsory conscription of Egyptian peasants, the fellahin. They came in 1-month rotations, some 20,000 men on the cut at any moment, drawn from a pool of up to 60,000. Caroline Piquet, historian of the Suez Company, puts the total mobilized between 1859 and 1862 at around 400,000 men. How many died is not known. The number has been a political weapon for 70 years. Nasser later put the death toll at 120,000. Piquet's judgment is blunt. There are no accurate archives to support this. The deaths were real, they were large, and nobody with the power to count them thought it worth doing. The corvée ended in 1864 in the most revealing way possible. Napoleon III, acting as arbitrator, ruled on the 6th of July that the forced labor must stop, and that Egypt must compensate the company for its loss. His award came to 84 million francs. The breakdown matters. 30 million for lands said had granted, and Egypt now took back, 16 million for the retroceded stretch of the freshwater canal, and 38 million as the indemnity for abolishing forced labor payable, like the rest in installments across 15 years. Egypt was ordered to pay a French company 38 million francs for no longer being permitted to conscript Egyptian peasants on its behalf. The bill for abolishing forced labor was presented to the people who had been forced to labor. On the 17th of November 1869, the canal opened. Now, The critical detail that changes everything, and it has nothing to do with engineering. When Ismail became viceroy in 1863, Egypt's external debt stood at roughly £3 million. By 1876, the funded external debt was about $68.5 million. With the floating debt, the cited totals approach 100. Egyptian state revenue over the same period roughly doubled. The debt rose more than 20-fold. Look at how it was done, because the terms are the argument. In 1862, a nominal $3.3 million netted Egypt about 83% of face value and cost nearly $8 million to repay. In 1864, the House of Fruhling and Goshen, the loan arranged by Henry Oppenheim, issued $5.7 million nominal. Egypt received $4.86. Remember that name? The same house took the railway loan of 1866. In 1867, the Imperial Ottoman Bank, $2,080,000 nominal, $1,700,000 received. In 1868, Oppenheim, $11,890,000 nominal, $7,195,000 received. In 1870, Bischofsheim and Goldschmidt, each at a discount, each netting Egypt far less than Egypt owed. And then in 1873, the loan that finished him, £32 million nominal, sold at a discount of about 30%. Egypt received under $20 million and was to repay some $77 million over 30 years, a real rate of interest around 11%. David Landis called his book on this business Bankers and Pashas. Its subject is not a conspiracy. It is a market, one in which the underwriters took their commission whether or not the debtor survived. By 1876, debt service consumed roughly two-thirds of Egyptian state revenue. Ismail was no innocent, a spendthrift autocrat who signed every contract. But he had been handed a loaded weapon by the most sophisticated financial system on earth, and everything he owned was now pledged. Everything except one thing. Which brings us to the 14th of November, 1875. And here the pace changes entirely. Frederick Greenwood, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, is dining in London. He learns from Henry Oppenheim, who helped arrange Ismail's loans, that the Khedive is trying to sell his Suez Canal shares. The tip-off does not come from the Rothschilds, it comes from a rival financier to a newspaperman. Greenwood goes to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Derby. Derby goes to Disraeli, and Britain is not seizing anything. Egypt is the seller, and on the evidence, the solicitor. Wilfred Scawen Blunt, an anti-imperialist who devoted his life to the Egyptian cause, records that Ismail most certainly applied to the English government for financial assistance through Colonel Staunton. In the autumn of 1875, Britain is buying a distressed asset from a bankrupt. On the 23rd of November, the Khedive names his price, 100 million francs. On the 24th, Disraeli writes to the Queen, the wording, even the medium disputed by his own biographers, with the line remembered as, "'Tis just settled. You have it, madam." As the story has always been told, that sentence is the moment. Britain takes the canal. It is not. The contract is signed the next day at Cairo between Major General Edward Stanton, the British Consul General, and Ismail Sadiq Pasha, the Egyptian Minister of Finance. Disraeli told his sovereign the thing was settled before it was signed. Disraeli's reason for using a private bank rather than the national one was legal, and he gave it on the floor of the Commons. It is against the law of this country for the bank to advance a sum of money to the ministry. That is his assertion in Debate, not a reading of the statute book, but the principle is real. The executive of the greatest empire on earth could not lay hands on £4 million because the Commons had not voted it, and the Commons had gone home. So the government borrowed, N.M. Rothschild and Sons advanced the purchase money. Ferguson notes a detail that punctures the mythology of an omniscient network. The London house could not coordinate with its own Paris branch, for fear the French side would leak it to the French government. The most powerful banking family in Europe could not safely talk to itself. Nor was it done in a single night. The affair runs from Greenwood's tip on the 14th to the signature in Cairo on the 25th. What was done in a single stroke was the commitment, a prime minister pledging the credit of the state with no legislature to stop him. Parliament could have disowned him when it came back in February. It did not. And here is where the threads converge in the driest place imaginable. The Commons debate of February 1876. Parliament reassembled on the 8th. On the 14th, the Chancellor, Sir Stafford Northcote, rose to ask for the money. He itemized it to the pound in public. The Khedive had been believed to hold 177,642 shares. The number, Northcote told the House, was only 176,602. A reduction corresponding with the reduced number of shares was therefore made in the purchase money, bringing it down to 3,976,582-S. Then the bank's fee. The government will pay them 2.5% commission on the purchase money, or £99,414. Read into the record by a cabinet minister, printed the following morning. On February 23rd, the Commons resolved that a sum not exceeding £4,080,000 be granted to Her Majesty, about £103,000 more than the shares cost, the difference being the commission and charges. Parliament did not merely tolerate the banker's fee, it voted it, and the permanent finance, the exchequer bonds that actually paid for Suez, was not sold to the Rothschilds, but to the savings banks. The shares were vested in the Crown by the Suez Canal Shares Act 1876, which directed that all receipts from them be carried to the Consolidated Fund. The opposition's objection was never secrecy. It was cost. The Spectator on the 26th of February 1876 worked the arithmetic. The Rothschilds had received £137,000 for lending £4 million to the British government for a term so short that their remuneration is at the rate of £15 per annum. That larger figure is the commission plus the interest on the advance. Two different things, Disraeli insisted. I deny altogether that the commission charged by the Messrs. Rothschild has anything to do with the interest on the advance. Both numbers are right. 99,000 is the fee, the rest is the price of the money. But the deeper objection was one Disraeli could not answer. Britain had bought 44% of the company's stock. The statutes capped the votes any single holder could cast, so 44% of the equity became about 3.5% of the votes. 10 votes at the general meeting, 3 seats on the board. French private shareholders, not the French state, which owned not one share, kept the other 56%, and with it the company. So what did 10 votes and 3 directorships actually do? The board sat in Paris, the statutes and the majority were French. The British government directors, Charles Rivers Wilson among the first, took their places in 1876 as a permanent minority in a foreign boardroom, and in the 6 years that followed achieved nothing anyone has pointed to. British ships carried the bulk of the traffic through a waterway whose tolls were set by other people, and British ship owners who petitioned were ignored. The tolls came down in the 1880s, not because Britain held 44% of the stock, but because Britain held Egypt. Worse, in 1869, Ismail had already sold 25 years of dividend coupons. Britain would draw no dividend until the mid-1890s. Instead, Egypt contracted to pay Britain 5% a year on the purchase money, about £200,000. Sit with that. Egypt sold Britain the shares, then paid Britain interest on the money Britain had paid for them, and Disraeli conceded every bit of it. He told the House, "I have never recommended, and I do not now recommend this purchase as a financial investment." His defense was imperial, not commercial. The purchase was a political transaction, calculated to strengthen the empire, on how power works. He was more honest than his mythologizers. If you have a large amount of capital in any concern, whatever may be the restrictions under which it is invested, the capitalist does exercise influence. Gladstone's reply was the flat opposite. First of all, I object to this purchase because it will give you no influence. Gladstone was right first. What happened next proved it. On the 8th of April 1876, less than 5 months after the sale, the Khedive suspended payment on Egyptian treasury bills. Egypt was bankrupt. The mission Britain sent that December under Stephen Cave had reported the opposite. Cave judged Egypt solvent, her resources sufficient, given time and honest debt service, and was attacked as too sanguine. Blunt thought Ismail had got what he went looking for, some public testimonial. In favor of his continued solvency, and to a large extent he succeeded in his plan. Cave's weakness on that point, Blunt wrote, was the beginning of the political intervention in favor of the bondholders. The report reached Parliament in the first days of April. Egypt defaulted within the week. £4 million had bought Ismail a few weeks. It bought his creditors a country. What follows is the part that is not taught, and it is the only part that matters. On the 2nd of May 1876, a Khedivial decree created the Caisse de la Dette publique, a debt commission staffed by the European powers, with a legal claim on Egyptian revenue. Ismail's personal debts and Egypt's public liabilities were merged into one obligation of some £91 million. As Blunt observed, in justice, and indeed, it might have been maintained in law, Ismail's debts were personal, not public ones. A ruler's private borrowing became a nation's inherited burden, the standard mechanism of sovereign debt ever since. Then the creditors sent their own men to write the terms. In the autumn of 1876, George Goshen went to Cairo for the British bondholders and Edmond Joubert for the French. They were not arbitrators, but representatives of the people owed the money, negotiating with a debtor who held no cards. Blunt called what they produced a truly leonine settlement, leonine in the lawyer's sense, where one party takes all. It reorganized the debt and, that November, installed Anglo-French dual control, a British controller of revenue, a French controller of expenditure, inside the government, and here's a conflict of interest nobody thought to hide. Goshen, the architect of the receivership, belonged to Fruehling and Goshen, the house that had issued Ismail's loan of 1864 and taken his railway loan of 1866. The man who wrote the terms of the collection had helped write the terms of the lending. He was not accused of corruption. There was no rule against it. Now look down to where the money came from. The law of liquidation of 1880 left Egypt roughly half its own income. That same year, Egypt's right to 15% of the company's income, its last direct stake in its own canal, was yielded to the Crédit Foncier de France for 22 million francs. By the early 1880s, Piquet writes, the company was rid of almost all its obligations toward Egypt. The money was gathered out of villages. Blount traveled Egypt in what he called the first of the 3 last terrible years of the Khedive Ismail's reign, while Ismail Sadiq, the same minister whose signature is on the share contract, still ran the collection. The tax collectors were in their villages, whip in hand, he wrote. We did not as yet understand, any more than did the peasants themselves, the financial pressure from Europe which was the true cause of these extreme exactions. The whip was the kurbash, a single thong of hippopotamus, or less often rhinoceros, hide about a yard long. Under European control, Blount still found the fellahin governed mainly by the kurbash. Every installment paid into a London bank was carried there on the backs of men whipped in the Delta. The rest is the logic completing itself. An Anglo-French ultimatum in June 1879 demanded Ismail's abdication. The Sultan deposed him and installed his son Tawfiq. In September 1881, Colonel Ahmed Urabi led a military revolt under the slogan Egypt for the Egyptians, a movement directed, Kathleen Burk writes, not only against the Khedive but against all foreign influence. Europe's fear, Burk notes, was specific, that the nationalists might cancel repayment of the huge national debt. On June 11th of June 1882, riots in Alexandria killed roughly 50 Europeans and some 170 Egyptians. On the 11th of July, the British fleet bombarded the city. The prime minister who ordered it was Gladstone, the man who 6 years earlier had said the purchase would give Britain no influence. On the 13th of September, at Tel el-Kebir, Sir Garnet Wolseley broke Arabi's army. British losses, 57 killed. Egyptian dead, approximately 2,000. Wolseley entered Cairo the next day and Arabi surrendered. The occupation began that September and ended, formally 72 years later. Why Britain did it is a live argument. Hopkins and Kane locate the engine in the city and the bondholders. Robinson and Gallagher argue strategy. Nobody in that argument needs a secret society. They argue about a budget. But there was another dimension to this, and it took 80 years to reveal itself. In June 1956, the last British troops left the Canal Zone. On the 26th of July, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. Britain was still the largest single shareholder. The 44% Disraeli had bought in 1875. Once the sold coupons ran out in the mid-1890s, Britain collected on a company that declared dividends of 17% in 1890, 21 in 1891, and 18 in 1892 figures read into Hansard in 1893. The purchase Disraeli insisted was not a financial investment had become one of the best the British state ever made, and it made no difference at all. When Britain and France went to war for the canal that autumn, the United States did not stop them with soldiers. It stopped them with money. Washington refused to support a British drawing at the International Monetary Fund unless Britain accepted a ceasefire and threatened to sell its sterling holdings. The pound buckled. Britain accepted the ceasefire, then drew $561 million, 4 times any previous drawing in the fund's history, as James Boughton, the IMF's own historian, records. Britain withdrew, and Anthony Eden resigned in January 1957. The symmetry is exact. In 1875, a British government that could not legally raise £4 million without Parliament went to a private bank to buy its way into Suez. In 1956, a British government that could not defend its currency without Washington was forced to give Suez up. In neither case was the decisive constraint on British power a fleet, an army, or a treaty. It was a balance sheet. I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where conspiracy theories flourish, and where this story is the raw material of one of the oldest and ugliest of them. The myth runs like this. The Rothschilds bought the Suez Canal in a night, secretly, on a handshake, and thereby bought Egypt and secretly owned the British Empire. Every load-bearing element of that sentence is false on the public record. It was not secret. It was announced, debated in the Commons, itemized to the pound, by the Chancellor, voted and enshrined in a public statute. Nor was it undocumented. The Rothschild Archive holds the Treasury and Bank of England correspondence, the receipt for the first repayment installment dated March 9, 1876, and a squabble over whether a leap year changed the interest owed. Not a handshake in the dark, an audited invoice with an arithmetic dispute attached. And the Rothschilds did not buy the canal, or Egypt, or anything. They were the government's banker for 5 months, at a fee their critics called excessive, and they were repaid. They never owned a single Suez share. The owner, by Act of Parliament, was the British government. They were not even Egypt's principal creditors. The slander is not a modern internet invention, and its pedigree is the argument. Within weeks of the purchase, Punch published Tenniel's Mose in Megiddo, Disraeli, a baptized Anglican, drawn as Moses, the key of India in his hand, the joke resting on his Jewish birth. The trope hardens from there through Goldwin Smith in 1878 on Lord Beaconsfield's Jewish Blood and Hitler in 1922 on the rapacity of a Rothschild, arriving at the 1940 Nazi film Die Rothschilds, which Ferguson describes as designed to prepare the German population for harsher measures against the Jews. And here is the uncomfortable part I will not duck. The claim that Rothschild finance caused the 1882 invasion did not originate on the far right. It originates with Blunt, the anti-imperialist, who wrote in 1907 that the financial connection of this too-powerful Hebrew house with Egypt was the determining cause, 6 years later, of England's military intervention. 5 years earlier, J.A. Hobson, the founding theorist of anti-imperialism, located the engine of empire in financiers who were men of a single and peculiar race. David Feldman of Birkbeck's Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism argues Hobson's anti-Semitism was structural, not incidental. And the truth is not a softer story. It is harder. This is not a story about a bank capturing a state. It is a story about a state so constrained it could not conduct its own foreign policy without a private bank's check. The point is not that a banker had power. The point is that the sovereign had none. Egypt's creditors foreclosed on Egypt, and Britain sent the army to enforce the receivership. No cabal is required to see that, only a ledger. Which is why the myth is not merely a slander. It is an alibi. It moves the guilt off the government that committed the money, off the parliament that ratified it, off the bondholders who were paid, coupon by coupon, in taxes extracted from Egyptian villages under the whip. Blaming a family lets every named, documented, minuted perpetrator walk out of the room. The conspiracy theory is not too harsh on the powerful. It is far too kind to them. Here, then, is the real lesson, and it is not a comfortable one. A country does not usually lose its independence to an invading army. It loses it to an interest payment. Ismail's Egypt was not conquered in 1876. It was foreclosed upon by a procedure under contracts it had signed by commissioners with a legal right to be in the room. The soldiers came 6 years later, and only because Egyptians objected. The order of operations is everything. First the loan, then the default, then the commission, then the controller, then the gunboat. By the time the gunboat arrives, every decision that mattered was taken years earlier by men in offices using arithmetic. The second lesson is aimed at the creditor, not the debtor. Britain was the richest state that had ever existed, and its prime minister could not spend a shilling the Commons had not voted. That restraint was the glory of the British Constitution, and Disraeli walked around it in an afternoon, not by breaking the law, but by finding the one door the law had left unlocked. Parliament did not punish him. It paid the bill, because the public loved the deal. The check on executive power failed not because it was weak, but because ignoring it was popular. You are living inside the same machine. When a government cannot fund itself without the bond market's consent, when a ministry's budget is written by its creditors, when a rescue package rewrites a nation's pension law and its labor code, that is not a secret, it is a contract. It happens in daylight, in language nobody reads, enforced not by soldiers but by the immovable fact that the money has to come from somewhere. The fellahin of the Nile Delta could see the tax collector. They could not see the coupon falling due in London, and the coupon was the thing that was whipping them. Sovereign debt is the oldest instrument of conquest still in daily use. It requires no conspiracy. It requires only a borrower who cannot say no, a lender who cannot lose, and a public that never reads the ledger. If you made it this far, leave the word ledger in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And tell me, was Disraeli's £4 million the shrewdest purchase in British imperial history, or the moment the empire proved it could be bought and sold like anything else on a balance sheet? I read every one. If this is the kind of deep dive you come here for, please subscribe. It genuinely makes a bigger difference than you might think, and it keeps this kind of work coming. I'll see you in the next one.